In the summer of 1944, the northern sector of the Eastern Front entered a phase of transition that did not follow a single pattern. In Belarus, Operation Bagration destroyed much of Army Group Center and pushed Soviet forces hundreds of kilometers west. On the approaches to Pskov, however, the front moved in shorter bounds. Here, geography, long-prepared fieldworks, and competing strategic priorities created a different kind of campaign. Pskov had been in German hands since July 1941. Before the war, it was a regional center on the rail line, linking Leningrad with the Baltic states and further south toward Belarus. After the Wehrmacht advance, it became a node in the rear of Army Group North, supporting operations against Leningrad and serving as a junction between lines running toward Ostrov, Daugavpils, and Tallinn. In 1943, as German commanders shifted to a defensive posture, the area around Pskov was integrated into the Panther defensive position, a system of field fortifications, anti-tank ditches, and strongpoints linking rivers and lakes into a continuous line. For the Soviet Union, Pskov carried both strategic and symbolic weight. The city was one of the oldest urban centers in northwestern Russia, occupied since the first months of the invasion. After the siege of Leningrad was broken in January 1944, Soviet planners viewed the liberation of Pskov as part of a broader task, pushing German forces away from the Leningrad region, restoring rail links, and opening routes toward Estonia and Latvia. At the same time, Stavka had to decide how to allocate forces between the decisive offensive in Belarus and the northern drive along the Baltic axis. In early 1944, the Leningrad front under Leonid Govorov conducted a series of offensives that pushed German formations back from the immediate approaches to Leningrad. By March, Soviet troops had reached the line of the Narva River to the northwest and the approaches to Pskov and Ostrov to the southwest. These operations inflicted losses on the German 18th Army, but also consumed Soviet reserves and transport capacity. By late spring, the front in the Pskov sector stabilized along the Velikaya River and the chain of lakes including Lake Pskov and Lake Peipus. The terrain around Pskov was a major factor in operational planning. The Velikaya River, flowing northward through the city, formed a wide water obstacle with marshy banks in many sectors and limited suitable crossing sites. Extensive forests, small lakes, and areas of peat bog reduced the possibilities for large-scale armoured manoeuvre. Road and rail networks were sparse, with a few main routes bearing most of the traffic for both sides. For the German defenders, this environment allowed a relatively small number of formations, supported by field fortifications and artillery, to delay a numerically superior opponent. For the Red Army, it meant that advances would have to be channeled through a limited number of corridors and bridgeheads. By June 1944, German Army Group North retained two main field armies, the 16th and 18th. In the Pskov sector, elements of the 18th Army held the Panther Line with divisions that had fought for years around Leningrad. Their staffs were experienced in defensive warfare in wooded and marshy areas, and they had constructed multiple positions in depth, including trench systems, bunkers, and gun emplacements on the western bank of the Velikaya. Although some divisions had been weakened by transfers of units and equipment to other fronts, German command compensated by concentrating artillery and anti-tank resources on likely crossing points and by integrating local terrain into their defense plans. On the Soviet side, the need to coordinate offensives across a wide front led to structural changes. In April 1944, the Third Baltic Front was formed, drawing formations from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts. Under Ivan Maslenikov, this new front became responsible for operations toward Pskov, Ostrov, and the southern approaches to Estonia. Among its principal field formations was the 67th Army, which had previously taken part in operations to break the siege of Leningrad and was now redeployed to the Velikaya sector. The 67th Army consisted mainly of rifle corps with attached artillery, engineers, and a limited number of tank and self-propelled gun units adapted for operations in restricted terrain. Intelligence assessments in the Soviet command in early summer 1944 reflected both opportunity and uncertainty. Reports indicated that German forces in the north had been forced to send some units to the collapsing Belarus front, and that supply lines to Army Group North were under pressure. However, German signals and aerial reconnaissance showed continued activity in the Pskov area, including construction of defensive works and movement of reserves along the rail lines from Riga and Daugavpils. Soviet planners had to assume that, despite attrition, the 18th Army would be able to mount a coherent defense along the rivers and forest belts. Public sentiment and propaganda framed these developments in different ways. In Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts, the lifting of the Leningrad siege and the approach to Pskov were presented as stages in the liberation of ancient Russian lands and the restoration of key communication lines. For German audiences, official communiques emphasized the defense of the Baltic region as a shield for East Prussia and the northern flank of the Reich, portraying the Panther Line as a prepared barrier that would absorb or slow Soviet attacks. Behind these narratives, both societies were coping with the cumulative human and material cost of years of war, and both commands were preparing for another offensive season in a sector where the outcome would depend as much on rivers and forests as on numbers of divisions. In July 1944, the opening phase of the Pskov offensive took shape within a wider pattern of coordinated Soviet operations. While the main blow of Operation Bagration was unfolding hundreds of kilometers to the south, the Third Baltic Front prepared to strike along the Velikaya axis. The intention was to exploit any weakening of German positions caused by the crisis in Belarus, but the timetable and resources available to Ivan Maslenikov's front reflected its secondary priority in the overall plan. In the first half of July, Soviet staffs refined operational orders for the advance toward Pskov and Ostrov. The 67th Army, commanded by Vladimir Sviridov, was assigned the central role on the sector leading directly to Pskov. To its flanks stood other armies of the Third Baltic Front, tasked with supporting attacks toward Ostrov and further west. The 67th Army's order of battle included several rifle corps, each with multiple rifle divisions, reinforced by artillery brigades, engineer battalions, and a modest contingent of tanks and self-propelled guns that had to operate on narrow roads and forest tracks rather than in open maneuver. On the German side, the opening phase was framed as a controlled withdrawal combined with a firm stand on key river lines. The 18th Army, under Georg Lindemann until his replacement in late July, coordinated the defense around Pskov and Ostrov. Corps-level commands allocated their divisions to sectors where the terrain favored defense, high ground near road junctions, prepared strongpoints covering bridges, and forest belts that restricted Soviet deployment. Reconnaissance units reported increased Soviet artillery registration and troop movements opposite the Velikaya, but German command expected that the main Soviet concentration of force remained in Belarus. The first concrete steps toward the July offensive were not dramatic breakthroughs, but a series of limited actions designed to improve Soviet positions. In early July, forward detachments of the 67th Army probed German outposts, seized minor elevations, and attempted to secure better jump-off lines near the river. These engagements involved battalion and regimental-sized forces, supported by mortars and divisional artillery. Casualties were counted in hundreds rather than thousands. But each local success or setback affected the geometry of the line where the main assault would later form. Command structures played a central role in shaping the opening moves. At the front level, Maslenikov received directives from Stavka that stressed the need to coordinate with neighbouring fronts and to prevent German forces from disengaging smoothly from the Pskov region. Within the 67th Army, corps commanders had to translate these broad instructions into detailed plans for crossing operations, allocation of engineer units, and positioning of artillery. Staff officers conducted terrain walks, studied aerial photographs, and identified potential crossing sites where bridging equipment could be brought forward under cover. The German command reacted to these signs of Soviet preparation by adjusting its own dispositions. Some forward positions east of the Velikaya were thinned out or abandoned in favour of stronger lines on the western bank. Demolition teams prepared charges on bridges and culverts, while artillery units were ordered to pre-register fire on likely crossing points and assembly areas. Communications between Pskov, Corps headquarters, and divisional staffs relied heavily on field telephone lines laid through forests and along roads, with radio nets as backup. Reports from front-line companies and battalions emphasized the steady increase in Soviet artillery fire and nighttime movement. For the soldiers in the frontline units, the opening phase of the offensive translated into a gradual rise in tempo rather than a sudden transformation. Soviet riflemen experienced more frequent night marches to new assembly areas, rehearsals of river crossing drills, and intensified political and instructional briefings about the forthcoming tasks. German infantry companies, many of them under strength after previous campaigns, faced stricter alert routines, more frequent patrols, and orders to conserve ammunition, while maintaining a convincing level of defensive fire. Civilians in the Pskov region observed these preparations from different vantage points. In villages near the front line, inhabitants saw columns of Soviet troops and supply wagons moving along forest roads, or German units pulling back through their settlements to new positions closer to Pskov. Some local residents had already been evacuated earlier in the year. Others remained in place under German occupation, uncertain whether the approaching offensive would reach their homes or bypass them as the front shifted. By mid-July, the structures for the offensive were largely in place. Artillery groupings had been assembled to support the 67th Army's assault sectors. Engineer units had stockpiled bridging materials and assault boats, and liaison arrangements with neighbouring armies had been clarified. On the German side, withdrawal routes through Pskov and further west had been surveyed, while rear services prepared to move depots and administrative offices in stages if the front line could no longer be held. The stage was set for the transition from probing actions and positional adjustments to the full-scale assault that would begin the battle for Pskov and test whether the broader momentum of the summer campaigns could be replicated in this difficult terrain. Strategic planning for the summer of 1944 placed the Pskov axis within a larger framework rather than at its centre. In Moscow, Stavka defined the destruction of Army Group Center in Belarus and the drive toward the Vistula as the main operational task. The Baltic sector, including Pskov, was assigned a supporting role. It was to secure the northern flank of the Belarus offensive, push Army Group North away from Leningrad, and create conditions for later operations toward Riga and the Baltic coast. This hierarchy of priorities shaped how many formations, guns, tanks, and aircraft could be allocated to the Third Baltic Front compared with fronts engaged in Operation Bagration. Within this framework, the Third Baltic Front received a clear but limited set of goals. Ivan Maslenikov's headquarters was instructed to break the German Panther Line on the Velikaya and in the Pskov-Ostrov sector, liberate key communications centres, and prevent the 18th Army from withdrawing in good order toward Latvia and Estonia. If possible, Soviet planners envisaged an advance toward the line of the Gauja and Ema-Jogi rivers, where future operations could threaten Riga and the Narva Group from the south and southeast. The destruction of large enemy groupings was desirable, but given the constrained resources and difficult terrain, the primary expectation was to force a retreat rather than to replicate the deep encirclements achieved in Belarus. The front's order of battle reflected this intermediate level of ambition. By mid-1944, the Third Baltic Front controlled several field armies, including the 42nd, 54th, and 67th, plus air support from the 14th Air Army. In May, The 67th Army alone counted 10 rifle divisions, an artillery division, an anti-aircraft division, and attached tank and artillery brigades. The front as a whole fielded roughly 20 rifle divisions and supporting formations, for a total strength later recorded at about 345,500 personnel in September, a figure broadly comparable to its July level. In the Pskov sector, this translated into several rifle corps and concentrated artillery, but only modest armoured forces that had to move on a limited road network. On the German side, the 18th Army's planning was governed by the need to hold the Panther Line as long as possible while preserving the core of its divisions for later withdrawal. The Pskov-Ostrov sector was defended by at least 2 corps-level commands, including the 28th and 38th Corps, each with several infantry divisions that had already accumulated experience in defensive operations around Leningrad and in the forests of northern Russia. Their objectives were to delay Soviet crossings of the Velikaya, inflict losses through artillery and minefields, and then, if necessary, execute phased retreats to secondary positions west and southwest of Pskov without suffering encirclement. Logistics and supply planning illustrated the different constraints facing both commands. For the Red Army, the main supply arteries ran north-south from the Leningrad region, feeding railheads and depots that had to sustain simultaneous offensive activity at Narva in the Pskov sector, and further south where 1st Baltic Front advanced toward WWII. Heavy artillery ammunition, engineer bridging equipment, and fuel for armoured units were distributed with priority to operations judged decisive for cutting Army Group North's land connection to Army Group Centre. For the 3rd Baltic Front, this meant that preparations for the Pskov-Ostrov offensive had to be calibrated to what the rail and road network could deliver without disrupting higher priority movements. German logistics also relied on a fragile network. Supplies for the 18th Army moved through the Baltic ports and inland rail hubs at Daugavpils and Riga, then forward by secondary lines and roads to Pskov and Ostrov. As Soviet forces pushed west in Belarus and Lithuania, these routes became more vulnerable to air attack and interdiction. Operational orders therefore assumed that stocks close to the front could not be replenished at the same rate as earlier in the war. Divisions were instructed to economize on artillery ammunition and fuel, while field engineers prepared demolitions for bridges, depots and rail facilities in case of withdrawal. Within the 3rd Baltic Front, planning for the Pskov-Ostrov operation placed the 67th Army at the center of the main effort. Its task was to break the Panther Line on the Velikaya, seize Ostrov, and then facilitate a northeastward advance toward Pskov by turning German positions along the river. Neighbouring armies were assigned supporting roles, one to press the German flank south of Ostrov, others to prevent reserves from moving freely along the rail lines toward Riga and Daugavpils. Artillery groupings were organised at army and front level, with counter-battery missions, support for river crossings, and planned barrages against identified strongpoints. German defensive planning emphasised depth and flexibility within political limits. Corps staffs laid out a system of main and intermediate positions anchored on villages, woods, and prepared bunkers on the western bank of the Velikaya. Behind these lines, further positions were traced to the southwest and west, aligning with routes toward the Baltic states. Orders stressed pre-planned counterattacks by regimental or battalion groups against any Soviet bridgeheads, but also recognized that sustained resistance on every line could not be guaranteed if breakthroughs occurred elsewhere and threatened to outflank the Pskov sector. Miscalculations emerged on both sides. Soviet planners, drawing confidence from the rapid collapse of Army Group Centre, expected that the cumulative pressure on the German Eastern Front would limit the 18th Army's ability to maintain cohesive defence over an extended period. At the same time, they underestimated the combined effect of difficult terrain, long-prepared fortifications, and the absence of large armoured formations capable of exploiting any breach. German command, for its part, counted on the Panther Line and the forests and rivers around Pskov to slow the Red Army, but could not fully account for the impact of future Soviet operations in Lithuania and Latvia that would later threaten the rear of Army Group North. Propaganda and public messaging simplified these complex calculations. Soviet statements presented the coming offensive as a step toward the liberation of Pskov and the Baltic region, linking it rhetorically to the broader successes of the summer. German communiques described the Panther Line as a secure barrier shielding the Reich's northern flank and stressed the determination of the 18th Army to hold its ground. Behind these contrasting narratives, both commands entered July 1944 with plans that recognized the strategic importance of the Pskov sector, but treated it as part of a larger, multi-directional struggle rather than an isolated battle. The clash for Pskov began in mid-July 1944 with a sequence of set-piece attacks along the Velikaya and around Ostrov. For the 67th Army, this phase meant turning weeks of preparation into a coordinated attempt to breach the German Panther position. For the 18th Army, it meant converting the theoretical strengths of river lines and forests into concrete resistance under growing pressure from artillery and infantry assaults. In the sectors assigned to the 67th Army, the opening blows took the form of concentrated artillery preparations, followed by infantry assaults on German forward positions east of the Velikaya and around key road junctions. Several rifle divisions, organized in corps echelons, advanced behind rolling barrages intended to suppress German strongpoints and disrupt communications. Engineer units accompanied the leading battalions, tasked with clearing minefields, marking lanes through obstacles, and preparing sites for future bridging equipment. In many places, the first objectives were villages and heights, forming part of the German security zone rather than the main river line itself. German frontline units experienced this transition from a period of probes to sustained attack as a sharp increase in fire density and tempo. Infantry companies manning bunkers, trenches, and field positions reported heavy shelling, including the use of heavy guns and rocket launchers, followed by infantry groups attempting to infiltrate between strongpoints under cover of smoke and forest. In some sectors, the defenders managed to hold their forward lines, relying on pre-registered artillery fire and counterattacks by reserves. In others, the initial Soviet push forced withdrawals to intermediate positions closer to the river. Around Ostrov, south of Pskov, early engagement saw Soviet forces attempting to cut road and rail connections that tied the German defense together. Here, units of the Third Baltic Front advanced along corridors where the terrain allowed somewhat more movement than in the heavily forested zones. Armoured and self-propelled guns, though limited in number, could support infantry attacks on village strongpoints and road junctions. German commanders responded by concentrating artillery and anti-tank weapons in these sectors, accepting that some outlying positions might be lost, but aiming to preserve the cohesion of the defence along the main Panther Line. For the 67th Army's soldiers, the first days of the offensive involved repeated assaults against positions that had been improved over months or years. Rifle companies advancing across clearings or along narrow causeways found themselves under intersecting fields of machine gun and mortar fire. Attempts to seize footholds near the eastern bank of the Velikaya were often met by immediate German counterattacks, conducted by small groups supported by close-range artillery. The pattern of the fighting produced gains measured in individual strongpoints and small stretches of trench rather than rapid advances. Civilians living near the combat zones were drawn directly into these engagements. Villages used as defensive localities were subjected to shelling from both sides, setting houses and barns on fire and forcing inhabitants to seek shelter where possible. Some local residents were evacuated by German authorities in the days before the offensive. Others left on their own as the fighting intensified. For those who remained, the first phase of the clash brought a change from a static front to a landscape of movement with columns of Soviet troops advancing through forests and German units falling back toward the river line. As Soviet pressure mounted, German artillery and mortars played a central role in attempting to stabilize the situation. Batteries positioned on the western bank of the Velikaya and on higher ground behind the front engaged Soviet assembly areas, crossing points and concentrations detected by observers and aerial reconnaissance. Fire plans had been prepared in advance, allowing rapid shifts between targets as reports came in. However, ammunition stocks were not unlimited, and some divisions were instructed to prioritize fire missions directly affecting the integrity of the main defensive line. Soviet artillery, for its part, sought to neutralize these guns and to cover infantry advances with sustained barrages. Counter-battery units used sound ranging, flash spotting, and air observation to locate German batteries. In some sectors, this effort reduced the intensity of German fire long enough for infantry to close with defensive positions. In others, well-camouflaged German guns remained active throughout the day, contributing to the attrition of attacking battalions. The balance between these artillery duels varied along the front, contributing to uneven progress. By the time the offensive had been underway for several days, both commands had to adjust their expectations. Soviet reports recorded the capture of several localities and improvements of the tactical position east of Pskov and around Ostrov, but also noted that the main German line on the Velikaya remained largely intact and that attempts to force crossings on a broad front faced stiff resistance. German summaries acknowledged that Soviet forces were pressing along a wide sector and that some forward positions had been lost, yet concluded that the Panther line still held and that no major breaches had yet occurred. Morale in frontline units reflected this mixed picture. Many Soviet soldiers saw tangible signs of progress in the form of liberated villages and captured German positions, but also encountered the limits imposed by terrain and fortifications. German troops, aware of the wider crises unfolding in Belarus and elsewhere, drew some reassurance from the fact that their immediate positions still functioned, even as they faced sustained pressure and mounting casualties. The first engagements around Pskov and along the Velikaya thus set the pattern for a campaign in which gains and withdrawals would be closely tied to the interplay between local tactical successes and the larger operational picture across the Eastern Front. As the offensive progressed into the second half of July, the fighting around Pskov and Ostrov entered a phase of escalation that stressed both commands. For the Third Baltic Front, local gains had to be translated into a breach of the Panther position. For the 18th Army, holding the Velikaya and the approaches to Pskov now meant managing mounting losses while planning for the possibility of withdrawal. South of Pskov, pressure intensified around Ostrov. Soviet forces committed additional rifle divisions and artillery groups to this sector, seeking to break through along the road and rail corridor that linked Pskov with Daugavpils and Riga. The fighting for Ostrov's outskirts involved repeated assaults on fortified villages, river crossings, and anti-tank ditches. Armoured and self-propelled guns, deployed in small packets along the few usable roads, supported infantry attacks but were constrained by marshy ground and narrow approaches. Several German strongpoints changed hands more than once as counterattacks pushed Soviet units back from newly gained positions. Casualties rose accordingly. Rifle regiments that had entered the offensive with several thousand men each now reported companies reduced to a fraction of their strength after days of attacks across open ground, minefields, and narrow causeways. German infantry battalions, already below full establishment before the offensive, suffered from attrition in key specialist roles such as machine gunners, signallers, and engineers. Medical services on both sides operated near their limits, with evacuation routes complicated by damaged bridges and continuous artillery fire. In the Pskov sector, the crisis centered on the Velikaya River. Soviet engineers attempted to expand small bridgeheads and ferry crossings secured by forward units, often under direct fire from German positions on higher ground. Assault boats and improvised rafts were used to move platoons and light equipment across the river at night or under smoke screens. Each successful crossing threatened to unravel local German defences, but each failure exposed attacking units to concentrated artillery and machine gun fire. The river thus became both a physical and operational barrier, shaping where and how the offensive could escalate. Command difficulties grew more pronounced. At the front headquarters, Maslenikov had to balance demands from different army commanders for reinforcements and additional artillery support, while also responding to Stavka's expectations of progress toward Pskov and beyond. Signal delays and the fragmentary nature of reports from saturated sectors meant that decisions were often taken on the basis of incomplete information. On the German side, the 18th Army's staff received increasingly urgent messages from corps and divisions about ammunition shortages, exhausted infantry, and the risk that local withdrawals might turn into uncontrolled retreats if not coordinated. Weather and terrain amplified these problems. Summer rains turned forest tracks into mud, slowing the movement of guns and supply columns. Fields churned by shelling became difficult to traverse for vehicles, and even for infantry carrying weapons and ammunition. In low-lying areas along the river and in the woods, smoke and mist could both conceal and confuse, hindering observation for artillery and air support. For units on both sides, the combination of limited visibility, dense vegetation, and shell-damaged ground made coordination across even short distances a challenge. Politically, the stakes of the fighting were interpreted in different ways. In the Soviet Union, announcements highlighted the liberation of individual localities and the advance toward Pskov and Ostrov as evidence that German positions in the north were weakening in parallel with the crisis in Belarus. However, internal correspondence and staff assessments acknowledged that the rate of advance in the Pskov sector did not match the sweeping movements further south. In Germany, propaganda emphasized the continued resistance of Army Group North and the role of the Panther Line in containing Soviet offensives, but high-level discussions in Berlin and at Army Group headquarters increasingly turned to how long the Pskov-Ostrov position could be held without risking encirclement. Reinforcements were limited on both sides. The Third Baltic Front received some additional artillery units and individual replacement battalions, but many available reserves across the Eastern Front were drawn instead into the main battles in Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine. German command shifted battalions and batteries within Army Group North to plug gaps around Pskov and Ostrov, occasionally transferring small units from quieter sectors. Yet the overall strength of the 18th Army continued to decline. This meant that escalation in the Pskov offensive took the form not of dramatically larger forces entering the field, but of existing formations being pushed closer to their endurance. For the soldiers, the crisis phase was marked less by sweeping operational maneuvers than by a sense of continuous pressure. Soviet infantry experienced a cycle of attack, consolidation, and renewed attack with limited pauses, while artillery units fired long barrages that strained gun barrels and supply stocks. German defenders rotated companies through front and reserve positions where possible, but many units remained in place for extended periods due to manpower shortages. Instances of local panic or disorderly withdrawal occurred, as did episodes of determined resistance that held up attacks for hours or days. By late July, the cumulative effect of these pressures began to alter the situation around Pskov and Ostrov. Although the Panther Line still functioned in many sectors, Soviet gains south of Pskov and in the Ostrov area threatened to compromise the coherence of the whole position. German commanders faced a growing dilemma: whether to commit their remaining reserves to hold the current line at high cost, or to begin a staged withdrawal that would concede Pskov but preserve the core of the 18th Army for further defence in the Baltic region. The peak of the campaign around Pskov came in the days when the Third Baltic Front committed its main reserves, and German command decided that the Panther position could no longer be held in full. South of the city, Soviet formations intensified their pressure on Ostrov. After several days of house-to-house and street-to-street fighting, German units began to withdraw from the town to prevent encirclement, and formations of the front entered Ostrov around 21st July 1944. The capture of this junction cut one of the principal road and rail routes connecting Pskov with the interior of the Baltic region and signalled that the entire line along the Velikaya was under threat. For the 67th Army, the critical effort now focused directly on Pskov. Artillery units were massed to deliver prolonged bombardments on German positions east and south of the city, as well as on bridgeheads and defensive installations on the western bank of the river. The fire plan included suppression of known artillery batteries, destruction of bunkers and strongpoints, and interdiction of roads leading into and out of Pskov. During this phase, the density of guns per kilometre of front in the main assault sectors rose noticeably compared with earlier in the month, reflecting the concentration of available resources. Infantry and engineer units worked in close coordination. In selected sectors, night crossings and small daytime assaults enlarged bridgeheads on the western bank of the Velikaya. Engineers established pontoon bridges under cover of smoke and anti-aircraft fire, while ferries transported guns and supplies. Rifle divisions rotated assault battalions to maintain pressure. Some regiments crossed the river multiple times as positions were gained, lost, and regained. The crossing operations around Pskov in these days represented the highest intensity of effort by the 67th Army during the offensive. Inside and around Pskov, German units of the 18th Army attempted to balance resistance with preparation for withdrawal. Rearguard detachments, often composed of elements from several battalions, held strong points in suburbs, on road exits, and near remaining bridges. Demolition teams destroyed infrastructure judged no longer defensible, including sections of the rail yard, warehouses, and smaller bridges, while leaving some routes open for the passage of heavy equipment and supply columns. Artillery and anti-tank guns covered these movements from temporary positions that were abandoned once Soviet pressure drew too close. Civilians in the city experienced this phase as a rapid succession of bombardments, troop movements, and administrative orders. Under German control, some inhabitants were evacuated along the remaining rail lines, others left on foot or by cart, and many stayed in place, seeking shelter in cellars and surviving buildings. As Soviet artillery fire intensified and German units began to pull back, civilian access to food stocks, medical care, and basic services became irregular. For those who remained when the front passed through the city, the peak of the campaign meant both the end of occupation and the onset of new uncertainties. At higher levels of command, decisions taken during these days shaped the outcome. Reports from Army Group North indicated that continued defence of Pskov risked exposing the 18th Army to flanking attacks from the south, where Soviet advances in the Baltic and Belarus sectors threatened to cut major lines of retreat. German leadership therefore authorised a staged withdrawal toward new positions further west and northwest, accepting the loss of Pskov, while aiming to save the bulk of the army for subsequent defence lines in Latvia and Estonia. Orders to divisions specified timetables for pulling out heavy weapons, medical units, and staff elements, while rearguards were to delay Soviet forces without becoming isolated. On the Soviet side, Stavka and the Third Baltic Front viewed the imminent fall of Pskov as both an operational achievement and an opportunity to accelerate pressure on the retreating enemy. Directives emphasized exploiting success with rapid pursuit where terrain allowed, while maintaining the capacity to conduct further river crossings and assaults against prepared positions ahead. Air units were tasked with increasing strikes against columns moving west from Pskov, rail installations and temporary bridges, although weather, forest cover and German air defence limited the extent to which retreat routes could be disrupted. By 23 July 1944, Soviet formations entered Pskov, and the city changed hands after 3 years of occupation. The capture of the urban area and nearby crossings marked the peak of visible success for the operation. An important regional center and communications node was restored to Soviet control, and the Panther Line in this sector was effectively breached. At the same time, large parts of the 18th Army had already begun to withdraw along pre-planned routes, preserving many of their core units and much of their artillery for the next defensive line. For soldiers on both sides, these days left distinct impressions. Soviet participants experienced the entry into Pskov as confirmation that the months of fighting in forests and along the river had yielded a concrete result, while also observing that German forces were not collapsing in the way seen in some sectors of Belarus. German troops experienced the withdrawal as a disciplined but pressured movement under fire, with rearguards engaging in short, intense actions before pulling back. The peak of the Pskov offensive thus combined a major local success with clear signs that the campaign in the Baltic region was far from decided. Once Pskov had changed hands, the character of the fighting shifted from a struggle for fixed positions to a contest of pursuit and organized retreat. The Third Baltic Front attempted to convert the breakthrough into deeper gains, while the 18th Army concentrated on preserving cohesion as it fell back toward new defensive lines in the Baltic region. Both sides now had to adapt their methods to a moving front that still ran through forests, lakes, and limited road networks. For the 67th Army, the immediate task after the city's capture was to stabilize its own formations and restore combat effectiveness for further advances. Rifle divisions that had taken part in river crossings and urban fighting reorganized their companies, integrated replacements, and redistributed weapons and ammunition. Artillery units moved forward from positions east of the Velikaya to new firing lines west of the city, often along roads damaged by demolitions and bombardment. Engineer formations shifted from bridging and assault tasks to road repair, mine clearance, and the construction of supply routes suitable for heavy guns and vehicles. The broader front adapted by redistributing responsibilities. While some armies of the Third Baltic Front prepared to push toward Ostrov's hinterland and the Latvian border, others were directed toward Estonia and the Tartu axis. This dispersion reflected both strategic intentions and practical limits. Rail repair units could only restore a certain number of lines at a time, and fuel and ammunition stocks had to be allocated between several ongoing operations. As a result, the exploitation phase after Pskov did not involve a single concentrated drive with massed armour, but a series of advances by infantry heavy formations moving along separate corridors. German adaptation took another form. The 18th Army reorganized its divisions into flexible groups to conduct delaying actions. Battalions from reduced regiments were combined into Kampfgruppen, structured around remaining heavy weapons and experienced cadres. Rearguards occupied temporary positions in villages, forest edges, and road junctions, fighting short engagements before pulling back through pre-prepared gaps in minefields and demolition belts. Engineers destroyed bridges, culverts, and sections of road at selected points, forcing Soviet columns to halt while repair units went to work. Terrain again shaped how both sides adjusted. The same forests and lakes that had anchored the earlier defensive system now provided cover for retreating units and obstacles for pursuers. German commanders used side roads and forest tracks to move artillery and support elements at night, reducing exposure to Soviet air attacks. Soviet staffs responded by increasing the use of reconnaissance detachments and forward patrols, which moved ahead of main forces to identify ambushes, mined stretches, and possible bypasses around destroyed infrastructure. Tactical methods evolved under these conditions. Soviet infantry formations increasingly relied on small assault groups equipped with light machine guns, mortars, flamethrowers, and demolition charges to clear rearguard positions without committing entire battalions. artillery support shifted from long preparatory barrages towards shorter concentrated fire missions intended to break resistance at specific strongpoints along the retreat routes. German units, for their part, placed more emphasis on sudden counterattacks by platoon or company-sized groups, seeking to disrupt Soviet efforts to organize pursuit and to gain time for columns further to the rear. Resource management became a central component of adaptation. The Third Baltic Front's logistics services worked to extend supply lines westward from the Leningrad region through newly repaired railheads and depots around Pskov. Fuel had to be transported over roads that remained vulnerable to weather and to damage from earlier fighting. Medical services established new collection points and hospitals in restored settlements, while still evacuating wounded over considerable distances. German rear services concentrated on salvaging vehicles, guns and stores that could be moved quickly, abandoning heavy equipment only when demolition was unavoidable or when roads became impassable. The psychological dimension of this phase was complex. For Soviet troops, the liberation of Pskov confirmed that steady pressure could yield results even in difficult terrain. At the same time, many soldiers observed that the German forces in front of them were not disintegrating, but conducting structured retreats that preserved combat capability. Expectations formed by knowledge of the large encirclements in Belarus did not fully match the reality of the Baltic sector, where every kilometre of pursuit involved overcoming new demolitions and rearguard actions. German soldiers, leaving positions they had held for years in the northern theatre, experienced a mixture of loss and professional focus. The withdrawal meant abandoning familiar defensive works and settlements, yet reports from units emphasised the continued ability to form new lines and to mount counterattacks when conditions allowed. Commanders at regimental and battalion level had to maintain discipline during long marches through forests and along congested roads, while ensuring that rearguards did not become isolated. Local populations interacted with these adaptations in varied ways. In some areas, civilians who had remained during the fighting provided information to Soviet units about German movements or about mines and demolitions. In others, inhabitants were primarily concerned with avoiding the routes of retreating and advancing columns, focusing on securing food and shelter amidst damaged infrastructure. Administrations set up by the Soviet authorities had to operate in towns and villages where transport and communications were still only partially restored. As the front moved west and northwest from Pskov, the pattern of resistance and adaptation confirmed that the campaign in this sector differed from the more rapid collapses elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The Third Baltic Front adjusted its operations to the constraints of terrain, logistics, and divided strategic priorities, while the 18th Army managed to trade space for time, retaining a significant portion of its strength for subsequent defensive lines in the Baltic states. The turning point of the Pskov offensive lay less in a single, spectacular battle than in a series of decisions that fixed its outcome. Militarily, it occurred when the fall of Pskov no longer threatened to destroy the 18th Army, but instead marked the transition to a managed German withdrawal and a redistribution of Soviet efforts toward other Baltic objectives. On the German side, the key moment came when Army Group North and the 18th Army concluded that the Panther position around Pskov and Ostrov could not be held without unacceptable risk. Reports from corps and divisions describe sustained Soviet pressure, local breaches south of Pskov, and growing difficulties in supplying forward units. At the same time, intelligence and situation reports indicated that Soviet forces in Lithuania and Latvia were advancing toward Šiauliai and the line of the western Divina, threatening to cut the land connection between Army Group North and the rest of the German Eastern Front. Under these conditions, the defence of Pskov lost its earlier strategic rationale. The decision to withdraw was coordinated with larger plans for shortening the front in the Baltic. Directives ordered the 18th Army to abandon positions on the Velikaya and around Pskov in stages, falling back toward new lines in the direction of Riga and the Estonian interior. Timetables specified dates and sequences for evacuating heavy equipment, ammunition, and administrative services, with rearguards tasked to hold until designated times before disengaging. This planning converted what might have become a disorderly retreat into a structured movement, even though it still took place under fire. For the Third Baltic Front, the turning point manifested as a divergence between operational and strategic momentum. Operationally, the capture of Pskov and Ostrov represented clear gains. Important communications centers were in Soviet hands, and the Panther Line in this sector no longer existed as a continuous barrier. Strategically, however, Stavka concentrated its main efforts on cutting off Army Group North further south and on advancing toward the Baltic ports that would decide the long-term fate of German forces in the region. This meant that the resources available to Maslenikov for deep exploitation from Pskov remained limited. In practical terms, this divergence shaped the pursuit west of Pskov. The Third Baltic Front could conduct active operations, but it did not receive the large tank armies or concentrated air support that characterized breakthroughs in Belarus and eastern Poland. Infantry heavy formations advanced along roads and forest tracks, forcing German rearguards to give ground, yet lacked the speed and mass to outflank and encircle major enemy groupings. Each demolished bridge or blocked route further reduced the chances of closing a large encirclement before the 18th Army reached new positions. The turning point also affected civilian experiences. For inhabitants of Pskov and its surroundings, the city's liberation on 23 July brought an immediate end to German occupation, but the continued fighting to the west meant that the region remained close to an active front. Soviet authorities began re-establishing local administration, transport, and basic services, yet many villages lay in zones where rearguard actions and demolitions continued. In the territories into which the 18th Army withdrew, civilians faced renewed military traffic, temporary requisitions, and the uncertainty of living behind a line that might again become a battlefield. At higher levels, the shift in focus became evident in planning documents and orders. The Third Baltic Front received tasks increasingly linked to the broader Baltic campaign, advancing toward Tartu, supporting operations aimed at Riga, and cooperating with fronts operating from the south and southwest. The Pskov offensive was thus retroactively integrated into a sequence of operations whose decisive moments lay further west, on the approaches to the Baltic ports and in the eventual isolation of German forces in the Courland region. From a comparative perspective, the turning point highlighted the contrast with Operation Bagration. In Belarus, the destruction of major German formations resulted from converging blows by several fronts into the rear of Army Group Center. Around Pskov, the same pattern did not materialize. The combination of demanding terrain, long-standing fortifications, the absence of large armoured groupings, and the priority assigned to other axes meant that once Pskov fell, and the 18th Army had begun an orderly retreat, the opportunity for a similar collapse largely passed. By late July and early August 1944, both commands recognized this outcome. Soviet summaries noted successful liberation of key centers and continued westward movement, but also acknowledged that major enemy forces had withdrawn. German reports recorded the loss of Pskov and Ostrov, yet emphasized that divisions had reached new lines with most of their heavy weapons and organizational structures intact. The turning point of the Pskov offensive, therefore, was the moment when the battle for the city ceased to be a potential trap for the 18th Army and instead became one stage in a longer sequence of withdrawals and advances across the Baltic region. By early August 1944, the Pskov offensive had shifted decisively into an aftermath phase, in which the main combat operations in the immediate area subsided and the consequences of the fighting became clearer. The front no longer ran through the streets of Pskov or along the eastern bank of the Velikaya. Instead, it moved west and northwest across the border regions toward Latvia and Estonia. For both the 3rd Baltic Front and the 18th Army, attention turned to consolidating what had been preserved or gained, and to preparing for the next stage of the Baltic campaign. German formations continued their staged withdrawal in accordance with directives from Army Group North. Corps and divisional staffs guided columns along predetermined routes toward new defensive lines closer to Riga, Valga, and the interior of Estonia. Rearguards left behind near rivers, road junctions, and forest edges conducted short delaying actions and then disengaged, falling back on transport columns that had already moved heavy equipment. In this process, some units lost stragglers and heavy weapons to Soviet pressure or to breakdowns, but the bulk of the 18th Army remained intact and reassembled in new positions further west. For the 3rd Baltic Front, the immediate post-offensive period involved both pursuit and consolidation. Advanced detachments continued to pressure German rearguards where terrain permitted, but larger formations needed time to restore cohesion. Rifle divisions that had fought at Pskov and Ostrov restructured depleted battalions, integrated new drafts of personnel, and redistributed the remaining heavy weapons. Artillery formations moved forward into the liberated areas, occupying new firing positions that could support further advances, but also required secure supply lines and repaired roads. The material consequences around Pskov itself were extensive. The city and many surrounding villages bore damage from artillery bombardments, demolitions, and fires that had broken out during the final phase of the battle. Railway facilities, bridges, and warehouses had been destroyed or heavily damaged, either by fighting or deliberate German demolition. Soviet engineer and railway troops began work to restore key lines, starting with the routes linking Pskov to Leningrad and to the south, while local authorities assessed which buildings, public services, and industrial sites could be returned to use. Civilian life resumed under difficult conditions. Residents who had remained during the occupation and the battle now lived in a city with disrupted water, electricity, and transport. Food supplies were limited until new distribution systems could be organized. Medical services had to care for both military wounded and civilians affected by bombardments and by years of wartime shortages. In the countryside, inhabitants returning to their villages encountered houses destroyed or damaged, fields marked by trenches and shell craters, and areas contaminated by mines and unexploded ordnance. Casualty and prisoner handling formed another part of the immediate aftermath. Soviet burial teams and medical units worked along former front lines, collecting the dead and evacuating wounded from isolated positions or temporary dressing stations. Prisoner of war cages were established for captured German soldiers and for members of support units who had been overtaken during the German withdrawal. German medical services, now further west, dealt with their own streams of wounded from rearguard engagements and from earlier phases of the offensive, while reporting continuing personnel shortages in combat companies. From an operational standpoint, both commands evaluated the results in terms of territory, forces, and future options. The 3rd Baltic Front had regained Pskov, broken the Panther position in this sector, and advanced its front line nearer to the borders of Latvia and Estonia. However, major German formations had not been encircled, and significant elements of the 18th Army remained available to man new defensive lines. For German command, the withdrawal meant the loss of an important communications centre and a symbolic city, but also the avoidance of large-scale destruction of forces at Pskov itself. The broader Eastern Front context shaped interpretations of this aftermath. In Soviet planning documents, the Pskov offensive appeared alongside other operations that summer, contributing to the overall westward shift of the front, but not matching the scale of destruction inflicted on German forces in Belarus. In German assessments, the loss of Pskov was acknowledged as a setback, yet commanders emphasized that Army Group North still held a coherent front in the Baltic states and retained the capacity for further defense. For local populations across the newly liberated region, the end of active combat did not immediately restore pre-war conditions. Reconstruction had to proceed amid shortages, damaged infrastructure, and the proximity of a moving front. For soldiers on both sides, the aftermath of Pskov meant relocation rather than demobilization. Soviet units prepared for new operations further west, and German formations regrouped to defend shrinking territories in the Baltic region. The Pskov offensive thus closed with a landscape transformed by combat and with military forces already orienting themselves toward the next phase of the war. In retrospect, the Pskov offensive occupies a complex place in the history of the Eastern Front. It delivered a clear territorial gain with the liberation of an important regional centre, yet it did not produce the collapse of German forces that many observers associate with the summer of 1944. Understanding its legacy requires comparing intentions and outcomes and examining why the momentum of Operation Bagration did not fully extend into the forests and rivers around Pskov. One factor lay in strategic prioritization. In June and July 1944, Soviet High Command concentrated its main striking power in Belarus, where multiple fronts and tank armies converged on Army Group Center. The Baltic sector, including Pskov, received fewer mobile forces and a more modest allocation of artillery and air support relative to its tasks. The Third Baltic Front was expected to break fortified lines, liberate cities, and pressure Army Group North, but not at the expense of diverting resources from what was defined as the decisive theatre in Belarus and later in Poland. This choice shaped every subsequent step of the Pskov operation. Terrain and fortifications formed a second, equally important element. The Velikaya River, the chain of lakes around Pskov, and the surrounding forests restricted operational options. Even when Soviet troops achieved tactical success, the landscape offered limited opportunities for rapid exploitation. Roads and causeways could be blocked by demolitions or defended by relatively small forces, and prepared fieldworks transformed many sectors into attritional battlefields, rather than corridors for deep maneuver. Unlike the more open areas of Belarus, where armoured formations could drive into the German rear, the Pskov region imposed a slower rhythm. The performance and experience of the German 18th Army also influenced the outcome. Its divisions had spent years in the northern theatre, constructing and improving positions like the Panther Line and learning how to defend in wooded and marshy environments. Commanders at corps and divisional level proved capable of conducting phased withdrawals, combining rearguard actions with timely evacuations of heavy equipment. When higher command authorized the abandonment of Pskov, these staffs executed the movement in stages, trading ground for time and preserving a large part of their forces for further defense in the Baltic region. On the Soviet side, the Third Baltic Front and the 67th Army showed adaptation and persistence, but faced structural constraints. Their formations achieved river crossings, urban assaults, and pursuit operations, yet they operated largely with infantry and artillery, without the massed tank and mechanized groupings that elsewhere enabled encirclements. Command attention and logistical support were divided between several axes: Pskov, Ostrov, the Tartu direction, and later approaches to Riga and the Baltic ports. The offensive around Pskov therefore became one component of a broader campaign rather than a standalone effort to annihilate the 18th Army in place. For civilians, the legacy was measured less in operational diagrams than in the transformation of daily life. In Pskov and nearby settlements, the end of German occupation and the arrival of Soviet administration brought changes in legal authority, economic organization, and public life. Reconstruction of railways, bridges, and housing unfolded over years. In the territories to which the 18th Army retreated, inhabitants experienced another cycle of troop movements and defensive preparations, followed by further offensives that gradually narrowed the area under German control. In the wider course of the war, the incomplete breakthrough at Pskov contributed to the sequence of events leading to the formation of the Kurland Pocket. Because the 18th Army and other elements of Army Group North withdrew in relatively good order, they were able to staff subsequent defensive lines in Latvia and Estonia. Later, Soviet operations cut these forces off from East Prussia and the main German front, but large German groupings remained in the Baltic until the final months of the war. The failure to destroy them earlier at Pskov did not change the overall outcome of the war, yet it influenced where and how some of the last Eastern Front battles were fought. Historians and military analysts have approached the Pskov offensive from different angles. Some emphasize it as an example of how geography and prepared defenses could still limit offensive results in 1944, even when one side possessed numerical and material advantages. Others focus on command decisions, noting that Soviet leadership deliberately accepted a more gradual outcome in the Baltic sector in order to maximize effect in Belarus and Poland. Comparative studies underline that the standards applied to judge success or failure must account for differing objectives. In Pskov, the immediate aim of liberating a key city was achieved, while the more ambitious goal of destroying enemy field armies was only partially realized. For participants, the legacy remained personal as well as operational. Soviet veterans of the 67th Army and other formations recalled river crossings, forest fighting, and the entry into Pskov as evidence that persistence in difficult conditions could achieve concrete results. German veterans remembered the same period as a disciplined retreat from long-held positions, followed by continued combat on shrinking territories. Civilians carried memories of occupation, combat, and reconstruction that shaped local narratives about the war. In summary, the Pskov offensive stands as a case where the outcomes diverged from the patterns set by Operation Bagration. The city was liberated on 23 July 1944. The Panther position in this sector was broken, and Soviet forces advanced toward the Baltic states. At the same time, the 18th Army avoided encirclement and withdrawal, turned the battle into one stage of a longer campaign. The limits of the offensive arose from a combination of strategic prioritization, difficult terrain, skilled defensive command, and divided operational focus. These factors, taken together, explain why the momentum that transformed the map in Belarus did not produce the same degree of collapse on the approaches to Pskov, and why the region's wartime story continued beyond the liberation of the city itself.